The bank was busier than usual that afternoon, the steady hum of customers shuffling between counters blending with the distant clatter of keyboards and murmured conversations. At one of the tellers, an elderly woman stood with a frail posture, clutching a worn-out purse against her chest. Her silver hair was neatly combed, her clothes clean but simple, and her eyes carried the weight of years spent in quiet resilience. She hesitated before sliding a small piece of paper across the counter. "I need to withdraw some money from my account," she said in a gentle voice, her fingers trembling slightly. The young bank teller glanced at her, then at the balance on the screen, and immediately frowned. "Ma'am, you only have a small amount left in your account," teller said, her tone shifting from professional to dismissive. "We have policies about withdrawals below a certain limit." The old woman's lips parted as if to protest, but before she could form the words, another voice chimed in, sharp, impatient. "Honestly, why do people like you always hold up the line?" A man in a suit, standing behind her, rolled his eyes and checked his watch. "Some of us have real business to attend to." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the line. The teller's expression hardened. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but if you don't have enough funds, we can't process this transaction. Maybe you should come back with someone who can help." The woman's wrinkled hands tightened around the purse strap. She wasn't asking for charity, just her own money, money she had spent decades saving. Her voice wavered, but she tried again. "Please, I need this for my medication. It's important." The teller barely looked at her. "I've already told you the policy. Maybe next time, come prepared." More laughter. Another voice muttered something about wasting time. The old woman's face burned with embarrassment as she took a small step back, unsure of what to do. The weight of humiliation settled on her shoulders. And then, just as she turned to leave, the air in the bank shifted. A presence entered, subtle at first, but undeniable. The conversations dimmed, the chuckles died, and a hush spread like a wave of realization. A man in a casual black jacket and jeans stepped forward, his hands in his pockets, his gaze calm but sharp. The staff, the customers, even the manager who had been watching from a distance, all of them froze. Keanu Reeves. The name didn't even need to be spoken. The bank employees exchanged stunned glances, recognizing him instantly. The man in the suit who had mocked the elderly woman suddenly straightened, his confidence evaporating. Keanu didn't say a word at first. He simply looked at the teller, then at the old woman, his expression unreadable. The silence in the room stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Then, in a voice that was quiet but carried unmistakable authority, he asked, "Is there a problem here?" The teller's mouth opened, but no words came out. The manager, now pale, quickly stepped forward, scrambling for control of the situation. "Mr. Reeves, we weren't aware," he stopped mid-sentence, because Keanu wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the old woman. With a kind smile, he stepped closer. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the small slip of paper she still held in her hand. The elderly woman, still bewildered, handed it over. Keanu read the amount, nodded, then turned back to the teller. "Go ahead and process her request," he said, his voice calm but firm. The teller hesitated, clearly torn between following orders and the fear of having just embarrassed someone in front of one of the most famous and respected actors in the world. But Keanu wasn't done yet. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his own wallet, and what he did next left everyone speechless. The bank remained silent, every eye fixed on Keanu Reeves as he calmly held the elderly woman's withdrawal slip. The teller swallowed hard, her fingers hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. The weight of her previous actions now felt suffocating under the piercing gaze of one of the most well-known celebrities in the world. Keanu didn't rush her. He didn't raise his voice or demand anything. He simply stood there, waiting. But his presence alone was enough to change the air in the room. The manager wiped his forehead, clearing his throat awkwardly before stepping forward again. "Mr. Reeves, I assure you, we follow strict banking policies," he said, forcing a polite smile. This is just a misunderstanding." Keanu turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. A misunderstanding, he repeated, his tone neutral. Because it looked a lot like you were ignoring this woman's needs. She wasn't asking for anything unfair, was she? The elderly woman, still stunned by the unexpected turn of events, clutched the strap of her purse tighter. She had spent years being overlooked, brushed aside, treated as if she were invisible. But now, all of a sudden, people were paying attention. Not because she raised her voice, not because she fought back, but because someone with power had stepped in. The teller cleared her throat. I can process the withdrawal, she said quickly, her hands moving to the keyboard. The computer's screen glowed as she typed, her previous smugness completely replaced by nervous energy. But Keanu wasn't done. He glanced at the elderly woman and then, with a slight movement, pulled out his wallet. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. He wasn't flashy about it. No grand gestures, no dramatic statements. Just a simple, effortless action. He pulled out a card, tapped it against the counter, and slid it toward the teller. Add whatever she needs, he said softly. The room tensed. The man in the suit, who had earlier mocked the woman, shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing how cruel his words had been. A few of the other customers exchanged glances, some ashamed, others curious. The manager's forced smile faltered. The elderly woman's eyes widened, her lips trembling as she looked up at him. Oh, no, dear, I can't accept that, she said, shaking her head. I just needed my own money, that's all. Keanu knelt slightly so they were at eye level. And you're going to get it, he assured her gently. But no one should have to struggle just to get by. You worked hard for your money, and you deserve to be treated with respect. Tears welled in the woman's eyes. No one had spoken to her like that in years. Maybe decades. The teller, still flustered, completed the transaction, handing over the cash. Here you go, ma'am, she said, her voice noticeably softer than before. The elderly woman reached out with shaky hands, accepting the money. But she barely looked at it. Her eyes remained on Keanu, filled with gratitude, confusion, and something else, a deep, aching sadness. Keanu noticed. Are you okay? He asked, his voice quiet. She swallowed hard, hesitating. It's just, this reminds me of my husband, she admitted after a long pause. He always said people should be kind whenever they can. But the world's changed, hasn't it? Keanu exhaled slowly, considering her words. It has, he agreed. But kindness hasn't disappeared. It's just hiding in the right people. For a brief moment, the weight of the situation seemed to ease. The bank, once a place of cold rules and indifferent policies, felt warmer. Even the staff, some of whom had ignored the elderly woman moments ago, now looked at her differently. But then, just as things seemed to settle, something unexpected happened. The man in the suit, who had been quiet for too long, suddenly scoffed. Oh, come on, he muttered, rolling his eyes. This is ridiculous. Just because a celebrity walks in, everyone changes their tune? What a joke. The room tensed again. Keanu slowly turned his head, his expression still calm, but now, there was something sharper in his gaze. He didn't say anything immediately, letting the silence stretch. The man in the suit shifted, realizing too late that he had spoken aloud. You think kindness is ridiculous? Keanu finally asked, his voice quiet but firm. The man hesitated. I just think, people like her should learn how the world works. Not everyone gets special treatment. Keanu tilted his head slightly. Special treatment? He gestured toward the elderly woman. She was humiliated. Mocked. Denied what was already hers. If I hadn't stepped in, would you have even cared? The man opened his mouth but had no answer. He looked away, suddenly finding the floor very interesting. Keanu let out a slow breath before turning back to the elderly woman. Let's get you home safely, he said, offering his arm. The woman hesitated only a second before gently placing her hand in the crook of his elbow. She was still overwhelmed, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. As they turned toward the exit, the entire bank seemed to watch in silence. Some looked ashamed of how they had acted. Others seemed deep in thought. But one thing was certain, no one would forget what had just happened. Just as they reached the door, the manager suddenly stepped forward. "Mr. Reeves," he started, but Keanu didn't stop walking. Without looking back, he simply said, "Do better." And then, they stepped outside, leaving the bank, and everyone inside it, forever changed. As Keanu and the elderly woman stepped outside, the cool afternoon breeze met them, offering a stark contrast to the tension-filled atmosphere they had just left behind. The city moved on as if nothing had happened, cars passing, people walking, conversations blending into the hum of urban life. But inside the bank, everything had shifted. The employees stood still, unsure of how to process what had just unfolded. The manager rubbed his temples, frustration and embarrassment etched across his face. He had spent years enforcing policies, making sure everything followed strict guidelines, but today, those rules had been shattered with nothing more than a quiet act of kindness. The man in the suit, the one who had scoffed at it all, let out a slow breath. He glanced around, expecting someone to back him up, to agree that this whole situation had been overblown. But instead, all he saw were downcast eyes and thoughtful faces. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar, a tiny flicker of shame. Outside, the elderly woman still seemed overwhelmed. She held onto Keanu's arm, her small frame barely reaching his shoulder. Her fingers were cold, even through the warmth of his sleeve. "I still don't understand why you did that," she said softly. "Why would someone like you, someone important, step in for an old woman like me?" Keanu gave her a gentle smile. "Because people deserve to be treated with dignity," he said simply. "Fame doesn't change that." She nodded slowly but didn't respond right away. Instead, she clutched the money in her hand, a small amount in the grand scheme of things, but everything to her. She thought about the long walk back to her tiny apartment, the rising cost of her medication, and the quiet, empty rooms that greeted her every night. For years, she had managed on her own. But today had reminded her of something she had tried to forget, how lonely it felt to fight every battle alone. Keanu seemed to sense her thoughts. "Let me get you a ride home," he offered. Her first instinct was to refuse. Pride had always been her companion, even when life had been unkind. But something in his voice, something warm, steady, made her hesitate. I suppose that would be nice," she admitted. Keanu led her toward a sleek black car parked along the curb. The driver, who had been waiting patiently, nodded at Keanu in greeting before opening the door. As she settled into the comfortable seat, a deep sigh escaped her lips. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. But the moment of peace was short-lived. Across the street, just beyond the steady stream of traffic, a figure stood watching. Their posture was stiff, their gaze fixed on Keanu and the elderly woman with an intensity that didn't belong to a casual bystander. Their phone was raised, as if recording, or perhaps texting someone. Keanu noticed. His relaxed posture didn't change, but his sharp eyes locked onto the figure for a split second. The person, realizing they had been seen, quickly turned and disappeared into the crowd. A strange feeling settled in Keanu's chest, but he didn't mention it. Instead, he turned back to the elderly woman with an easy smile. "I'll make sure you get home safe," he assured her. She smiled back, but as the car pulled away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was happening, something much bigger than a simple trip to the bank. Back inside the bank, the tension hadn't faded. The manager retreated into his office, rubbing his forehead. His job was built on order, on maintaining control, but today had flipped everything upside down. He had ignored the elderly woman without a second thought, and now Keanu Reeves himself had walked in and put his entire staff under scrutiny. The worst part? It wasn't just about the celebrity. It was the realization that, deep down, they had been wrong. The employees were whispering among themselves, exchanging guilty glances. The young teller who had dismissed the elderly woman stared at her hands, her stomach twisting uncomfortably. And then there was the man in the suit. He tapped his fingers against the counter, his earlier confidence nowhere to be found. He had spent years believing that strength meant looking out for yourself, that the world was about who could move the fastest and push the hardest. But today, he had been made to feel small, not because someone had belittled him, but because someone had reminded him what real strength looked like. Outside, as Keanu's car disappeared down the street, another car pulled up in its place. A dark sedan, its windows tinted just enough to keep its occupants hidden. Inside, a man in a crisp gray suit lowered his phone, his expression unreadable. "He saw me," he muttered. The driver, a man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, glanced in the rearview mirror. "Think he recognized you?" "No," the man said after a moment. "But he knows something's off." The driver exhaled. "Do we proceed?" A pause. Then a slow nod. "Yeah. Let's see where this leads." The sedan pulled away from the curb, blending seamlessly into the flow of traffic. The city carried on as if nothing had happened. But something had shifted. And Keanu Reeves was now at the center of it. The car ride was quiet, the kind of silence that wrapped around everything, pressing down on it like a heavy blanket. The elderly woman glanced out the window, watching the city blur by, but her mind wasn't on the buildings or the passing cars. It was on the man who had stepped in to help her. Keanu Reeves. His calm demeanor had cut through the noise of the bank, but there was something else that lingered in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that his intervention had stirred something beneath the surface, something she hadn't even realized was there. As the car neared her apartment, she glanced at him again. He was still quiet, his eyes focused on the road, but there was a slight tension in his posture now. She wondered if he, too, felt the weight of what had just happened. "Do you always intervene like that?" she asked, her voice soft, almost tentative. Keanu turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze for a moment before looking back at the road. "I don't usually get involved," he replied. "But sometimes things need to be set right." His words hung in the air, both simple and loaded with meaning. The woman felt a shiver run down her spine. What did he mean by that? What had been set in motion by this small act of kindness? The car stopped in front of her building, and she took a deep breath before stepping out. Keanu followed her up to her apartment door, making sure she got inside safely. As she turned to thank him, she noticed something in his eyes, something like worry, maybe even fear. It was gone before she could register it fully, but it left her with an unsettling feeling. "Thank you," she said again, a little more shakily this time. "I don't know what to say." "You've done more than enough." Keanu nodded, but he didn't leave immediately. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking past her as if he was waiting for something, or someone. "I'll check in on you soon," he said, and though his tone was calm, there was a subtle undercurrent of urgency. "Take care of yourself." He turned and walked down the hallway, disappearing into the dim light of the building's stairwell. The woman closed the door behind her, locking it with a click that felt strangely final. Inside her apartment, the walls seemed to close in. The weight of the day's events, the humiliation, the unexpected kindness, and the mysterious tension surrounding Keanu's actions began to settle like a cloud in her chest. But just as she thought she might find some peace, her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from an unknown number. "We know who you are. Keep quiet, or things will get worse." Her heart skipped a beat. The message was short, but the threat in it was clear. She stared at the screen, her hands trembling. Who could have sent it? Was it connected to what had happened in the bank? She couldn't shake the feeling that Keanu's intervention had somehow triggered something much darker. Meanwhile, Keanu wasn't far away. He sat in the back of the car, staring out the window as the city passed by in a blur of neon lights. His phone had been silent since the moment he'd left the bank, but something gnawed at him. He had seen the figure watching from across the street, and he knew it wasn't just a coincidence. His mind raced as he replayed the events in the bank. The manager, the teller, the man in the suit, all of them had been complicit in something much bigger than they had let on. There was something lurking beneath the surface, something hidden in the cracks of their polished facades. He wasn't naive. He knew that people with power didn't like to be exposed. The fact that someone had reached out to the elderly woman just after his interference wasn't a coincidence either. He was being watched. Keanu's phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. The message was from an unknown number. His pulse quickened as he read it. "We know who you are. Stop interfering." He clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about one bank transaction. This was bigger. And it was personal. The car came to a sudden stop, and Keanu's eyes snapped to the rearview mirror. The driver, a man with a calm demeanor, glanced at him. "Someone's following us," Keanu said quietly, his voice steady but filled with a controlled intensity. The driver didn't ask questions. Instead, he pulled into a nearby alley and turned off the engine, the lights of the car dimming. Keanu sat in silence, listening to the faint sound of footsteps approaching. The tension in the air was thick, and Keanu knew he couldn't let this go any further. The door to the car opened, and a man stepped in. He was tall, dressed in black, with cold eyes that seemed to cut through the darkness. His presence was imposing, and Keanu immediately recognized him. He was one of the men who had been watching in the bank. "What do you want?" Keanu asked, his voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of danger. The man didn't speak at first. Instead, he stared at Keanu, studying him. "You don't belong here," he finally said, his voice low. Keanu's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" Before the man could respond, the car's interior was flooded with light. Another vehicle pulled up beside them, its headlights blinding. The man in black tensed, his hand moving toward his jacket. Keanu was already on alert. He reached for the door, ready to make his move, but then a voice rang out, stopping him cold. "Keanu, don't make this harder than it has to be." The voice was unmistakable. The man in the car didn't stand a chance. The air inside the car felt heavier, thick with unspoken tension. Keanu's fingers hovered near the door handle, his muscles coiled like a spring. The man in black, still seated beside him, didn't flinch, but there was something in his posture, something rigid, that suggested he hadn't expected this turn of events either. The voice from outside came again, this time firmer. "Step out of the car, Keanu." The headlights continued to glare into the vehicle, casting long shadows across the alley walls. Keanu squinted but couldn't make out the figure behind the light. His driver remained silent, waiting for Keanu's cue. Slowly, Keanu pushed the door open and stepped out, his boots hitting the damp pavement. The night air carried a chill, but that wasn't what sent a shiver down his spine. He could feel it, something was wrong. The figure emerged from behind the car, finally stepping into view. It was someone Keanu hadn't expected to see. A woman, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, her dark hair pulled into a neat bun. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes carried a weight that sent warning signals through his mind. "Keanu," she said again, her voice controlled, almost too calm. "We need to talk." Keanu didn't answer right away. He studied her face, searching for recognition. And then it clicked. She wasn't just someone watching from the shadows. She had been in the bank. She had been watching the entire time. His jaw tightened. "You were there." A small, knowing smile crossed her lips. "I see your memory's still sharp." The man in black finally stepped out of the car behind Keanu, closing the door with a quiet thud. Keanu didn't turn, but he could sense the shift, the way the woman's eyes flicked to her companion, as if silently reminding him to stay in control. "I don't know who you are," Keanu said, keeping his voice steady, "but I know you're not just another bystander." Her smile didn't waver. "You always had good instincts." That single sentence sent another warning bell through Keanu's mind. This wasn't just about what happened at the bank. This was something deeper. Something personal. "I work for an organization that prefers to remain off the record," she continued. "And we've been watching you for a long time." Keanu remained silent, letting her words sink in. "We didn't step in before because, frankly, you weren't a problem," she said, taking a step closer. "But now, you're interfering." Keanu's fists clenched at his sides. Interfering with what? Helping an old woman get her money? The woman's expression darkened ever so slightly. That's where you're mistaken. That wasn't just about money. That bank is a front. And you just exposed a crack in its foundation. Keanu's mind raced. A front? For what? The woman must have seen the shift in his eyes because she let out a small sigh. You should have just walked away, Keanu. Now you've put yourself in the middle of something you don't understand. Keanu exhaled slowly, his instincts now fully on edge. He had stepped into something bigger than he had realized. And whoever these people were, they weren't just some banking executives upset about a celebrity making a scene. They were protecting something. Behind them, the sound of another car approaching cut through the night. The woman tilted her head slightly, as if listening. Think very carefully about your next move, she said quietly. Because once you go past this point, there's no going back. Keanu met her gaze, his heartbeat steady, his mind already making calculations. He wasn't one to back down. And if they thought intimidation would work, they had picked the wrong person. Then I guess I'm already past that point, he said. For the first time, her calm expression cracked. The approaching car skidded to a stop, and before anyone could react, the back door flew open. A familiar voice rang out. Get in. Now. Keanu turned his head and felt his breath catch. It was the elderly woman. She was sitting in the back seat of the car, her face filled with urgency. Keanu didn't hesitate. He moved. The woman in the suit lunged forward, reaching for him, but Keanu was faster. He dove into the car, the door slamming shut behind him as the tires screeched against the pavement. The woman's voice rang out behind them. Stop them! But it was too late. The car was already disappearing into the city, leaving the shadows, and the unanswered questions, behind. Keanu turned to the elderly woman, his chest rising and falling with the adrenaline still coursing through him. What's going on? She looked at him, her eyes no longer fragile, no longer helpless. I was hoping you wouldn't get involved, she said quietly. But now, we don't have a choice. And with that, the final piece of the puzzle shifted. Keanu hadn't just stepped into a conspiracy. He had walked straight into a war. The car sped through the city streets, weaving through traffic as the headlights of their pursuers flickered in the rearview mirror. Keanu sat rigid in his seat, glancing at the elderly woman beside him. She was no longer the frail, helpless customer from the bank. There was something in her eyes now, something sharp, something knowing. Keanu took a breath, steadying himself. You need to tell me what's going on. The woman kept her gaze forward, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. That bank isn't just a bank, she said, her voice low. It's part of a network, an operation that launders money, buries information, and controls people who get too close. Keanu frowned. And you? She exhaled. I used to work for them. Decades ago. Back when I was still young enough to believe I was doing the right thing. The words hit him like a punch. He had expected a revelation, but not this. Then why were they targeting you? Keanu asked, his voice calm but firm. The woman finally turned to face him. Because I have something they need. Before Keanu could ask what, the driver took a sharp turn, tires screeching as the car barreled into an empty parking garage. The moment they were inside, the driver killed the headlights, plunging them into near darkness. They won't stop, the woman continued. Not until they get it back. Keanu studied her face. What do you have? She hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket. Keanu tensed instinctively, but when she pulled out a small flash drive, he felt something shift in the air. Whatever was on that drive, it was the reason she had been humiliated at the bank. The reason those people had followed them. This holds records, she said. Documents, transactions, names, everything tying them to the people they control. If it gets out, their entire empire crumbles. Keanu took the drive, turning it over between his fingers. It was small, unassuming, yet it carried the weight of something massive. He looked at her. Why me? Why now? A wry smile crossed her lips. Because you were the only person who didn't look away. A sudden noise cut through the silence. Footsteps. Keanu's body tensed. The woman's driver reached for something under his seat, a weapon, maybe, but before he could react, the garage was flooded with bright, blinding light. Engines rumbled. Doors slammed. They were surrounded. Keanu turned to the woman. Stay behind me. The car doors opened at once, and Keanu stepped out, his posture relaxed but ready. The woman in the suit stood in front of him, flanked by men in dark clothing. Their expressions were cold, calculated. You had your chance to walk away, she said, voice steady. But you didn't. Keanu took a slow step forward, the flash drive still in his palm. I don't like bullies, he said simply. And I really don't like when they target the wrong people. The woman's eyes flicked to the elderly lady still inside the car. She's not as innocent as she looks. Keanu's jaw clenched. Neither are you. The tension in the air was suffocating. One wrong move and the entire situation could turn violent. Then, the unexpected happened. A new sound echoed through the garage, a distant siren. Keanu's eyes narrowed. The woman's face twisted in frustration. Someone had called the police. The elderly woman finally stepped out of the car, standing beside Keanu. You've lost, she said softly, looking at the woman in the suit. It's over. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't respond. Her men remained still, waiting for her order. For a moment, no one moved. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Her men followed, disappearing into the shadows. Keanu exhaled. That's it? The elderly woman gave a small smile. They can't afford to be seen here when the authorities arrive. Not in the open. Keanu glanced at the flash drive still in his hand. So what now? The woman looked up at him. Now, we finish this. A beat of silence passed before Keanu nodded. He had started this fight without realizing it. Now, he was going to make sure it ended the right way. And just like that, the battle wasn't over, it had only just begun. As the distant sirens grew louder, Keanu took one last look at the woman in the suit as she disappeared into the shadows. For now, she and her people were retreating, but he knew this wasn't over. People like that didn't simply give up. They only waited for another opportunity. Keanu turned to the elderly woman. She stood tall, her gaze steady despite everything they had just been through. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation. Just a quiet resolve. We should go, she said. Before they changed their minds. Keanu nodded, gripping the small flash drive in his hand. He had been caught in plenty of unpredictable situations before, but this was different. This wasn't about him. This was bigger, dangerous, even. But now that he was in it, he couldn't just walk away. The driver quickly pulled the car out of the parking garage, merging onto the road before the police arrived. For a few minutes, no one spoke. The adrenaline was still fading, the weight of what had just happened settling in. Finally, Keanu glanced at the woman. What's on this drive? It's enough to bring them down. She nodded. It's enough to expose them, at least. But the truth doesn't always win just because it's out there. These people, they have power, connections. It won't be easy. Keanu turned the drive over between his fingers. He had spent years playing heroes on screen, but this wasn't a movie. There was no script, no guaranteed victory. Only real choices, real risks. The car pulled onto a quiet street, stopping outside a small, unassuming house. The woman exhaled. This is where I get off. Keanu hesitated. What happens now? She gave him a knowing look. That depends on you. He watched as she stepped out of the car, moving with the ease of someone who had been through too much to let fear slow her down. For a moment, he considered walking away, letting her handle it. But he already knew he wouldn't. With a sigh, Keanu followed her inside. The house was small but well kept, filled with old photographs and carefully arranged furniture. It was a home, a real one. She gestured for him to sit while she retrieved something from a drawer. When she returned, she placed a worn notebook on the table. "This is everything I remember. Names, dates, events. The drive is hard proof, but these notes tell the story behind it." Keanu flipped through the pages, scanning the handwritten notes. This wasn't just about money laundering or fraud. It was deeper: politicians, businesses, even law enforcement. A web of corruption carefully hidden in plain sight. He closed the notebook. "What do we do with this?" She met his gaze. "We find someone who can do the right thing with it." Keanu leaned back, running a hand through his hair. He knew people, good people, who could help. But even then, this wasn't a battle that would be won overnight. Exposing the truth was one thing. Making sure something happened because of it was another. After a long pause, he nodded. "I'll make sure it gets to the right hands." The woman smiled, a small but genuine expression of gratitude. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad you walked into that bank today." Keanu chuckled softly. "Yeah, me too." The night passed slowly, both of them taking turns going through the files, double-checking every detail. By morning, Keanu had a plan. He made a few calls, reaching out to trusted people who could ensure the information wasn't buried. When he finally stepped outside, the first rays of sunlight stretched across the quiet street. The air was cool, crisp. A new day. He turned back to the woman, who stood in the doorway watching him. "You'll be safe?" he asked. She gave him a small nod. "I've survived this long. I'll be fine." Keanu hesitated for a moment before offering her the flash drive. "You should keep this." She shook her head. "No. You're the only one who can make sure it gets where it needs to go." He held her gaze, then slipped the drive into his pocket. As he walked toward the waiting car, he knew this wasn't the kind of fight that ended with a single act. But it was a start. And sometimes, that was enough. As the car pulled away, Keanu took one last look at the house in the rearview mirror. The woman stood there, watching, but there was something different now. She wasn't just an elderly lady at a bank anymore. She was a survivor. And thanks to her, a battle that had been fought in the shadows for years was finally stepping into the light. Keanu exhaled, his grip tightening around the flash drive. It wasn't over. But for the first time, the right people had the upper hand.